If trans men then have to use women's toilets, that's going to make women less safe, because how are you going to stop a man, a normal man, going into a woman's toilets and saying, I'm a trans man?
Other girls standing in the line for the bathroom.
I don't follow that logic.
Why?
Because the point is that we're saying that people who are biologically men shouldn't be using women's toilets. That's the point of this ruling, among other things.
Other girls standing in the line for the bathroom.
But a trans man is biologically a woman.
Someone who's transitioned from being a woman to a man is...
And so they would then have to use women's toilets.
Other girls standing in the... Other girls standing in the... Other girls standing in the...
I think this...
There's abuse, vilification and violence against trans people on a daily basis. I think the way the media are dealing with this is completely wrong, and it resonates almost with the old Section 28 debate. Same argument, same challenging, same characterisation, same stereotyping, if you like. And in years to come, we will look back at this period and say that the way this issue was dealt with was completely wrong, just as we look back now at Section 28 and know that that was completely wrong. Trans rights are human rights, and I support the right to self-identification. You know, just as we stood up against Section 28, we've also got to stand up here for trans rights and take that fight on.
Do you believe a trans woman is a woman?
Look, I think the Supreme Court has answered that question. And I think, look, a woman is an adult female, and the court has made that absolutely clear. I actually welcome the judgment because I think it gives real clarity.
What are your words for the trans community who are worried about what this could mean for them?
Fuck off.
Other girls standing in...
The return of the sausages.
So, it finally happened. The UK Supreme Court, a totally legitimate body that definitely takes every perspective into account, as long as they actively hate trans people, has ruled that trans people no longer exist. No Equality Act, no Gender Recognition Act, none of these things exist anymore, because a bunch of old white men decided that they know better than everyone else in the country what sex and gender are. And they are, apparently, completely binary and completely immutable. It's a shame that decades of scientific research were proven wrong by the opinions of a bunch of aging lawyers, but I guess science no longer matters.
Should I just kill myself now and be done with it?
You can test things and prove things as much as you want, but if you disagree with J.K. Rowling, well, she's infallible. She's basically the Pope, but for people that hate queer people, so she's basically the Pope.
How does it feel to you when a figure like J.K. Rowling says Labour, your party, has abandoned women?
I'm pretty depressed, to be honest.
So, all your science, I'm afraid it goes out the window. And the fact that the main man behind this decision, the main judge, Lord Hodge, is literally J.K. Rowling's neighbour and is an open and proud advocate for conversion therapy, should absolutely never be examined in any capacity. Trans people are now illegal. And just in time for the judge presiding over such a monumental ruling to do a favour for his neighbour and keep his queerphobic agenda going before he literally is set to retire in December. I love being from Normal Island, a place that's definitely not the heart of a dead empire, lashing out in all directions at any minorities it can find in a sad attempt to try and deflect from the fact that everything is broken and is only ever going to get worse.
They were scared. They were absolutely petrified, and I'm not surprised, because you see some of the people who were out this weekend waving banners saying they want to bring back witch burning or they want to hang you.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
And so I guess this is going to have to be the last video from this channel, because I no longer exist. I'm Brigitte Empire, or at least I was once. And I am now unsure whether I'm allowed to go to the bathroom in my workplace, the Daily Telegraph, the only newspaper with no urinals in any of the bathrooms, because Dan here's penis fell off during the Suez Crisis, and it's been floating somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean ever since. And I am genuinely really fucking scared. And this is why. In the words of Jess Thompson from Queer AF, the legal definition of a woman in the UK now excludes trans people after a Supreme Court ruling defined sex as biological sex, sex assigned at birth. The ruling will have a devastating impact on trans rights in the UK and has already drastically reduced them. Trans people now can't make equal pay claims and can be excluded from all single-sex spaces under any circumstances. The UK Supreme Court handed down its decision in the case of For Women Scotland versus the Scottish Ministers, ruling that for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, sex is to be defined exclusively as what it calls biological sex. This expressly excludes trans people holding a gender recognition certificate from being recognised as their legal sex under the Act. The court simplistically defines biological sex as the sex of a person at birth. This means, presumably, sex as initially recorded on one's birth certificate, a matter of documentation and presumption, rather than actual biology. It said, "To reach any other conclusion would turn the foundational definition of sex on its head and diminish the protection available to individuals and groups against sex discrimination." The decision opens by pitting two groups against each other. On one hand, all women, and on the other, trans people. This insidious framing sets the tone for a judgment which uncritically relies on anti-trans narratives. The judgment cites extensively from so-called gender-critical campaign groups and academics. Not a single trans person was allowed to speak before the court. Needless to say, the Supreme Court does not understand biological sex, and I'm not entirely surprised at that fact. They're lawyers. They have no background in science, which is why they should have consulted actual scientists in these areas, or at least trans groups, to hear why they would oppose this claim. Instead, they did not. They listened to For Women Scotland, a transphobic hate group consisting of a bunch of literal trans exterminationists, and funded to at least the tune of £70,000 by billionaire Last of Us zombie impersonator J. Jonah Jameson K. Rowling, who, when considering the question, trans people, hero or menace, just like her namesake, decided we were indeed menace, and thus donated a substantial sum of her own money, got by your mum and your family and your friends, all buying those Harry Potter books, towards a decision aiming to ban all trans people from public toilets, and hopefully from public life entirely. Since, as we all get to later, she's been much more open about her actual attitudes about trans people recently. She doesn't actually believe we exist. She thinks all trans women are men with fetishes who are trying to force their fetish on all society so they can wank endlessly at the idea of going to Tesco in a dress and paying their taxes but with tits this time. Or at least that's the justification she's made to herself to justify her disgust. She's not well. She also thinks trans men have been tricked and are secretly women trapped in a lie told to them by horrible trans women who are all fetishistic, and that they will all be liberated by trans women being destroyed, and they will finally be free to do what they've always clearly wanted to do, which is presumably to be a housewife in a heterosexual marriage. Clearly this is what they want, and not at all would this be being forced back into the closet to fit an extremely conservative view of womanhood, and likely suffer intense gender dysphoria for the rest of their lives. J.K. Rowling, like all of these people involved in For Women Scotland, badly needs to talk to a therapist. But even if she did, it still wouldn't change the damage she's now done to the trans community, and the pain she will and has already caused. In fact, there are already several public cases of cisgender women being assaulted and even for using women's bathrooms by people who thought they were trans. And now, with this decision, that number will only increase. And that's not even going into not being able to demand equal pay, when trans women get paid even less than cis women. And the Supreme Court's decision to rule that trans women can no longer be lesbians, which was news to my partner, who, when I told him the Supreme Court of the UK said they were now heterosexual and they're not a real lesbian, told me that the UK is not a real country. And honestly, you can't argue with that. I'd take that decision to the Supreme Court.
The return of the
girl standing in the line for the bathroom.
Even if you were going to be weird about biological sex, which you shouldn't be, it definitely doesn't align necessarily with sex assigned at birth, as the Supreme Court has now decided it must. There are multiple facets to what we consider biological sex, which includes your brain, or what people will often simply call gender if they're splitting gender and sex cleanly apart, which is kind of weird and messy since they're both intertwined, but it's a start. It also includes genitals, secondary sexual characteristics, and hormone levels. Now, I have next to no testosterone in my system. I have a female hormone profile. I've had bottom surgery, so I no longer have a wanger, and I have big mommy milkers. In the eyes of many, I am biologically female. Certainly, in the eyes of science, I tick more than half the boxes of what makes up biological sex, even if I don't necessarily tick every single one. I mean, I haven't got my chromosomes tested, but it's probably a safe assumption that I have XY chromosomes, but I have no idea. For all I know, I could meet them all. I am biologically a woman. If you want to argue that I'm not, and that there's a middle ground, well, first of all, you're wrong, but second of all, the Supreme Court has decided that no, being in between is illegal. That every single person is either male or female based entirely on their assigned sex at birth, which you might have noticed legally erases intersex people, who I suppose will not now exist in a weird limbo, and will instead, at the whim of the Supreme Court, crumble into literal dust like Spider-Man at the end of Avengers Endgame. Miss Rowling, I don't feel so good.
Other girls standing in the line for the bathroom.
Don't worry though, because this decision was super logical and unbiased, which is why they didn't hear from any trans people and listened only to people who want us thrown into the giant wood chipper in the sky. From Jesso Thompson again. The judgment cites extensively from so-called gender-critical campaign groups and academics. Not a single trans person was allowed to speak before the court. The judgment goes out of its way to give special thanks to Ben Cooper KC, acting on behalf of Sex Matters, who were allowed to intervene in the case, stating that he gave focus and structure to the argument that sex should be given its biological meaning. Cooper has previously acted on behalf of gender-critical activists Maya Forstater and Alison Bailey. At one point, the judgment explicitly refers to a trans woman as a man who identifies as a woman. In its analysis of the Equality Act 2010, the court placed great emphasis on certain provisions, claiming that a definition of sex which included trans people holding a gender recognition certificate would be inconsistent. One element the court relied on to make this argument was that of pregnancy. The Equality Act 2010 refers frequently to pregnant women, but because trans women cannot get pregnant, but some trans men can, by referring to women it says Parliament must have intended woman to mean biological female, as only biological females can become pregnant. The court also emphasises the idea that to include trans women within women as a class would render it a heterogeneous grouping, rather than the distinct group of biological women and girls with their shared biology leading to shared disadvantage and discrimination faced by them as a distinct group. By rooting misogyny in women's shared biology, rather than our shared oppression under patriarchy, the Supreme Court relies on incredibly conservative ideas about gender as a naturalised phenomenon. In reality, trans women experience misogynistic discrimination as much as, if not more than, many other women. The court concludes that a lesbian must be a female who is sexually orientated towards or attracted to AFAB females. The court concludes that female here cannot include trans women, as the concept of sexual orientation would be rendered meaningless, and, in its opinion, wrongly affect the composition of lesbians as a group. The court claimed this would lead to an inevitable loss of autonomy and dignity for lesbians. It points to evidence from gender-critical groups like the LGB Alliance and the Lesbian Project to make this argument. They claim the inclusion of trans women is having a chilling effect on lesbians to associate in lesbian-only spaces. The vast majority of lesbians reject this claim. In fact, lesbians in the UK have a better opinion of trans people than trans people. This really isn't the group you want to be citing to make this case.
We thought we were going to see rights for women rolled back, and today the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that
I am Adolf Hitler, command of the Third Reich.
So obviously this is super worrying, but if you know anything about the judge presiding over this case, Lord Hodge, it's not surprising. He's a neighbour of J.K. Rowling who's due to retire this year, and this is entirely speculation, I'm assuming he decided to do one last favour for his friend before throwing in the towel. It's not against his principles to do so either. He previously headed a commission on same-sex relationships for the Church of Scotland, which was published in 2011, ultimately recommending that the gays of Scotland avoid same-sex relationships and undergo conversion therapy to pray that stinky gay away. In fact, that's probably why he chose to ignore the fact that the minister who introduced the Gender Recognition Bill in 2003 explicitly stated the intent of the nature of trans protections in the UK, which runs completely counter to the claims made by Lord Hodge and team in this cruel decision. Lord Filkin, the man in question, said, "A transsexual person will have protection under the Sex Discrimination Act as a person of the acquired sex or gender," which is very clear, tells us the intent of previous legislation and is, funnily enough, the exact opposite of the opinion of the Supreme Court, who apparently don't just not care about the science of trans people, or the opinions of any trans people or anyone who isn't actively part of an anti-trans hate group, but also don't care about even the opinions of the people who made the legislation they're supposedly trying to work out the opinions of. Truly, this is a level of competence and care that you only see in the great post-austerity British state. Just nonsense and horseshit from front to back. That's Britain to me.
The return of the
people who have kind of taken it upon themselves to be the gender police, gender police, gender police, gender police, gender police.
And yet, I don't get to make the law. So even though in 2 minutes I can debunk the argument of the most incompetent of judges, I don't get a say in the process. And as such, I will have to comply with the decisions of the Supreme Court. You know, the law is the law.
Gender police.
And I'm an upstanding moral citizen.
Gender police.
And as such, I will, despite my wishes, be detransitioning.
Gender police. Gender police.
Because as a person with a human body, I need to use public bathrooms so I'm not constantly pissing and shitting myself in public. And according to the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK, this ruling, despite not saying anything like this, means that I can't use the toilet in public. Julie Bindel, a famous transphobe and columnist for cool and normal fascist newspapers the country over, suggested that trans people can solve this problem by building our own toilets, which is totally doable, and not at all something that someone completely detached from reality to the point where they're neck deep in the fucking astral plane would say. So, what choice do I have? Either I stay inside all day and never leave the house, becoming completely isolated from my family and friends, unable to get food or eat or go outside to work, and therefore die alone in my flat, since this government has also made it impossible to live without a job, even if you're literally physically incapable of doing so, or I detransition. I become the first office worker at your local Excel spreadsheet factory to use the men's bathroom with a pussy and big mommy milkers. Sure, I started getting kicked out of men's toilets for being in the wrong bathroom over a decade ago, but Judge Conversion Therapist Rolling Neighbour has deemed that this is how we must live, so for the first time on this channel, I'm revealing my male name to you.
Gender police.
Lesbian only spaces.
Gender police. Gender police.
Lesbian only spaces.
Gender police. Gender police.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Dean Transitioner, and I'm devastated to inform you that J.K. Rowling was right. I was indeed a man all along. A man with a fetish for living as a woman every second of the day, despite being on the asexual spectrum and having a libido lower than the literal ocean floor. Yes, us trans women, we were all men in disguise, grinning with glee at the thought of going to the women's bathroom, to pee quietly in a locked stall for 10 seconds before washing our hands and leaving. You know, leaving without doing anything. A lascivious ploy, nah? Indeed, my grand plan, my master plan, was to derail my promising academic career by going from being respected and promoted in my field to being denigrated, denied every job opportunity, and made to feel stupid and inadequate by the very same people who previously promised I had a bright future ahead of me. And it worked. I expertly tanked my career in paleontology by disguising myself as a woman. I expertly crafted a situation where I would be physically attacked and by strangers and non-strangers alike. I'm the only people who managed to figure out the sinister plan I, Dean Transitioner, had concocted, along with my fellow so-called trans women, were J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, the genius, and the noble Fedayeen in 4 Women Scotland, who, with a confirmed £70,000 donation from J.K. Rowling, a woman who took a picture celebrating this ruling looking like she was transitioning into Andrew Tate, but with a meatier tuck, won this case for all women. And definitely have not set off a chain of events that will inevitably lead to butch women and postmenopausal women being attacked in women's bathrooms for not sufficiently serving cunt for some bold white man in Weatherspoons with a face like an old hemorrhoid. Oh, it feels good to be myself again. Take me to the nearest Weatherspoons.
How are you going to serve, provide loos for trans people?
I don't know the answer. Pubs have an advantage in they have a gender-neutral loo anyway.
So, what do I have to do? Let's ask Jesso Thompson again, I guess. The decision seems to make it lawful to exclude trans people from single-sex spaces under any circumstances. Previously, it was thought that to exclude trans people from a single-sex space, the exclusion had to be shown to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Now, the exclusion is automatic for trans people trying to access a space which does not coincide with their biological sex assigned at birth. Instead, the court explains that the exclusion is intended to additionally prohibit trans people from accessing spaces aligned with their biological sex. The only saving grace here is that service providers still need to demonstrate that it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim to establish a single-sex service in the first place. This still lets anti-trans activists have their cake and eat it too, forcing trans people out of public life in many spaces. Given the example of a counselling session for female victims of sexual assault, the court determines that as sex means biological sex, trans women would automatically be excluded from attendance. It explains the group might also choose to exclude trans men if proportionate, for example, if reasonable objection is taken to their presence, for example, because the gender reassignment process has given them a male appearance. Lots of people argue against the exclusion of trans women from women's toilets by pointing to trans men. Surely, they ask, you don't want a bearded trans man using the women's loo? But the argument of the court shows the danger of relying on these rhetorical traps, which also enforce gendered norms about how people should look to use certain toilets. The reality is that anti-trans campaigners don't want trans people to exist, let alone use any public toilets. The Supreme Court, however, claims that this ruling does not lessen trans people's rights. Trans people can still claim discrimination based on a protected characteristic of gender reassignment, regardless of their sex. The court also states that while trans women can still be protected from discrimination based on sex, on the grounds of perception, that is, that whilst they are considered male for the purposes of this act, they can still be discriminated against by someone perceiving them as female. This does, however, raise the possibility of a defense that your discriminator knew that you were biologically male, so they couldn't have been perceiving you as female. However, it is likely that this claim could then be framed as a discrimination based on gender reassignment. More worryingly, the court acknowledges that this removes equal pay protections from trans women with a gender recognition certificate, who will no longer be able to claim that they are being underpaid compared to male colleagues. However, the court justifies this on the basis that the right is simply being transferred to a different group of trans people, trans men with a gender recognition certificate, who will now be able to bring such claims against male colleagues. This is even though trans women remain significantly underpaid, even more so than their cis female colleagues. And just in case you were still thinking that the Supreme Court ruling is made in the spirit of helping women and protecting their rights, the ruling actually is so rooted in misogynistic thinking that it claims the abilities of women drivers are biologically determined at birth. Now, I'm just a regular cisgender bloke, but I think these courts have considerably lacked foresight in these decisions, particularly in the wake of rhetoric that's come out after this. Former Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption warned in the wake of the ruling that organisations are potentially misinterpreting the ruling, saying that there was no obligation to exclude trans women, only that you are allowed to exclude trans people. Well, that's alright then. This is such a fucking enlightened centrist both sides take. Oh, trans people don't want to be discriminated against, but transphobes want to discriminate against them, so how do we solve this? Oh, I know, by making it so discrimination is legal and hoping that it only happens sometimes. These comments are, presumably, wet as they are, a response to the absolutely batshit rantings of Baroness Faulkner, chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who is put in the role essentially to dismantle it and its legitimacy and turn it from an advocacy arm of the government to being its justification for turning all trans people into red mist. In fact, Faulkner was set to be removed from her position last year when Labour won the general election, but was kept in her post despite being a frothing-at-the-mouth fascist who's only marginally to the left of Adolf Hitler. On the Supreme Court decision, Baroness Goebbels said, very normally,
"It means single-sex services, like changing rooms, must be based on biological sex. If a male person is allowed to use a women-only service or facility, it isn't any longer single-sex. Then it becomes a mixed-sex space. But I have to say, there's no law that forces organisations, service providers, to provide a single-sex space, and there is no law against them providing a third space.
Asked how she would respond to trans people who were worried about not being able to use any public loos or changing rooms as a result of the ruling, she said,
There isn't, first of all, there isn't any law saying that you cannot use a neutral third space, and they should be using their powers of advocacy to ask for those third spaces. But I think the law is quite clear that if a service provider says we're offering a women's toilet, that trans people should not be using that single-sex facility.
Now, the
steer from the Supreme Court is quite clear in that regard.
Okay,
so that clears things up then. Despite Faulkner being extremely wrong about what this nonetheless horrible ruling actually says, she thinks that trans people should now refrain from using public toilets that are gendered. How convenient that this means, in her own words, that we should be fighting for gender-neutral bathrooms, something that often does not exist in public spaces and thus would force us to stay out of the public eye and locked at home where we can't give anyone the ick. Essentially removed from public life, unless we can get every public space to have gender-neutral toilets. Gender-neutral toilets also being a measure which transphobes like Faulkner have relentlessly been rallying against existing and forcing to close, because they don't want us in public life. They want us all back, like I am, in the closet. Or more accurately, they don't believe we actually exist. They think we're all weird perverts, and they think this will all go away because it'll mean we give up the charade. But this isn't a charade? However you say it. This isn't a fetish. I barely have a fucking libido at all. I'm just going about my business. I don't get any pleasure from this. I barely get sexual pleasure for anything. This is my fucking life. I just want to live. So what am I supposed to do? Well, when asked which changing room a trans woman should use, Labour Minister Karen Smith could not answer. So that's cool. Even cooler is the fact that she used this opportunity to go on TV and not only celebrate this cruel and awful ruling, but claim this ruling meant that the Conservative Party should apologise for not being transphobic enough.
It was the Conservatives that started looking at self-identification, for example, under Theresa May. It was the Conservative leader of the party in the House of Commons who stood at the dispatch box and said trans women are women.
This, along with some other news that I'll get to later, has brought me to a realisation that the Labour Party deserves to burn to the ground. And just in case you're thinking I might be a little too angry, even though those comments suck, she added, just to add salt to our wounds, that she will force the NHS to comply with this ruling, along with every public body, something hospital staff have already begun to speak out about and protest against. On top of that, the British Transport Police announced that this ruling means trans women will now be searched by male officers, which basically guarantees SA. Cool and normal. Thanks, Keir Starmer. I love change. So just as I was getting ready to start putting this whole thing together in video form, everything recorded, all clips compiled, the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK, issued their interim guidance in light of this Supreme Court decision. Now, the EHRC is, to put it bluntly, completely and utterly fucked, and it has been for years. Under Tory control, Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, made it his business to stack government agencies with Conservative loyalists. When he was turfed out, Liz Truss only had time to do 3 things in office, before, obviously, dying in battle with a lettuce and being replaced with the guy who everyone during the pandemic by bribing them to go to public spaces and spread around a deadly virus. Just Tory things. Those things were, number 1, crash the economy. Number 2, murder the Queen. And number 3, replace the head of our Equalities Board, the EHRC, with the most bigoted piece of shit she could find. You will recognise her name as the EHRC head, making comments that make everything worse at every opportunity throughout this video. Baroness Kishwa Faulkner. Baroness Faulkner has a long history of meeting with transphobic hate groups, and upon her appointment, changed the EHRC from a fairly useless, if leaning good, body that tried to make sure the government didn't do anything too overtly bigoted, to demonising minorities and particularly trans people at every opportunity, resulting in calls by multiple civil rights groups to remove its status as a recognised national human rights institution, and many of its senior officials, including a board member, resigning en masse due to, in their own words, the transphobic direction of the organisation back in 2023. Obviously, things have not gotten better since. And so it should perhaps not be a surprise that they have officially responded to this Supreme Court judgment in the most evil way they could possibly have done, besides putting us into camps. And that is, essentially banning trans people from public spaces and establishing a system of segregation in the biggest rollback of civil rights in British history, and according to Jamie Warren from Queer AF, potentially the biggest human rights disaster since the end of racial segregation and apartheid. According to the EHRC guidance, trans women cannot use women's toilets, or men's toilets, and trans men cannot use men's toilets, or women's toilets. The guidance covers all services open to the public, as well as workplaces and schools, so pretty much everywhere that's not literally some dude's house. Now, it does advise that all public places should now build gender-neutral facilities, which would take years, and assumes everywhere has the room, the money, and the permission to do so. And that last part is key, because this current configuration of the EHRC is Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Tory party's baby. And under the Rishi Sunak government, she changed building regulations to make it much harder to provide gender-neutral toilets. So, where do we go? Well, if Baroness Faulkner had her way, we would detransition or stay at home forever, out of sight and unable to give anyone the ick. What we should do, instead, is, frankly, mass disobedience. And if the law says we can't pee in the men's or the women's toilets, well then, perhaps we should show them what happens when we do what the law says, and just piss on the floor outside the toilets. That'll make this a real fucking issue they have to pay attention to, because a lot of people will be upset. We need to show this absolute shit show of a government that there are consequences for these actions. We will not disappear. And for that, I think we're going to have to do something to start making a lot of people very uncomfortable, to make it clear why this guidance is unworkable. The alternative is literally disappearing from public life entirely, and we're not going to go down like that. Oh, and also, the guidance says trans women aren't allowed in lesbian groups anymore, because of course it does. Goodbye, Tegan and Sarah. Hello, following Wes streeting around with a shiwi, insisting that he's my new gender-neutral toilet. Happy Lesbian Visibility Week, everyone.
And they're basically saying, well, we're just going to make them all non-gender specific. But I think you're saying that's not the way to go.
No, that's not the way to go. And
gender police, gender police, gender police, gender police, gender police.
And in trying to justify this decision, the hate group behind this case, and the only group the court was willing to hear from, For Women Scotland, said, "This only became an issue because they began to push very, very hard on women's spaces. It really wasn't quibbling about toilets. It was for women in need of single-sex spaces for often devastating reasons, where they were vulnerable or required intimate care. Those included crisis centres or gynecological examinations. At the same time, she said, some trans activists became more aggressive and provocative in women's spaces. If people could just have been a little more sensible, this wouldn't have happened." And no, that's absolutely bullshit. No one was talking about any of this stuff. You brought this up. You were making stories up for yourself and getting aggressive. I can't think of a single case of a trans woman demanding gynecological examinations. You brought this shit up. You made shit up to try and scare people, to justify your bigotry. You are fighting what-if scare stories you made up in your head to make us look like boogeymen, because you think this is some sort of elaborate role play. If you could just talk to trans people and consider maybe developing a sense of empathy, you might understand the harm you are causing by pissing yourself at the thought that someone might have been born differently from you. You hateful little fuck.
Gender police. Gender police.
Listen, you know that For Women Scotland were right, because they got their money from a billionaire who celebrated this from a super yacht in international waters, smoking a cigar in victory, while her multi-billion-dollar property gets a brand new TV show. You know, your classic underdog story. And here they are celebrating, with champagne and smiles, jumping for joy at the idea of a tiny percentage of the population being subjected to new levels of state-inflicted cruelty. And what are they celebrating? Well, given the ruling doesn't at all mean what they say it means, you might well assume they're just off their gourds on a fine cocktail of hatred and delusion. But given the response of the EHRC and other authorities basically saying the ruling means beating all trans people to death with hammers is now both legal and moral, maybe they're just as bonkers as each other. From their signage, it looks like they're celebrating a... Sorry, what does that say? Large gametes. Is this the least relatable a protest has ever been? Who looks at a sign that says large gametes and says, damn right, about time, let's break out the champagne, love large gametes, instead of, you know, quietly pulling aside the woman with a nonsensical placard and slowly ushering her back into her bed in the care home. But besides the brave champion of large gametes, who else is amongst this crowd of heroes? Why, there's Helen Joyce, the absolute heroine, who famously called for the complete extermination of transgender people, making sure to note she included those who are happily transitioned and not bothering anyone, in those who will joyously and girl-bossily be sent to the wall.
Everybody who was on the wrong side has to sheepishly head over to the right side.
You have said that we need to keep down and control the number of people who transition, and you've also said that every single person who transitions is a problem in a sane world. Now, can you see why that might be interpreted as something very serious?
I can see why if you take it out of context and you want to, but I'm going to explain to you what I actually said and why I stand by those exact words. So in the book I explain how
I am Adolf Hitler, commander of the Third Reich.
This ultimate victory for feminism. Famously, feminism is when a bunch of old white men use the state's monopoly on violence to crack down on minorities and define women entirely by their biology. Just like in that famous sci-fi book about a feminist utopia in America. What was it called again? Oh yeah, The Handmaid's Tale. Under his eye, more like under her eye, yeah! Girls get it done. The thing is, 4 Women Scotland and their patron, J.K. Rowling, do not believe that trans people exist. They think we are evil monsters trying to trick a naive society into letting us run around with presumably massive erections and dresses on, torturing women for the sake of a fetish. This is absolutely insane and wrong on so many levels I barely know where to start, but it's genuinely how they think about us. Or at least the story they tell themselves about why they feel that way, to justify the baseline disgust they feel, which is just the natural bigotry. And to demonstrate that, here is a recent tweet by J.K. Rowling, making it clear how she thinks and talks about trans people when she's not choosing her words carefully to try and hide her power level. I've heard straight men talk about trans women as though they're fallen men to whom sympathy ought to be automatically extended, but there's deeper stuff going too. I asked a lefty straight man I know, this is in real life, whether he was aware of how many penised lesbians are involved in the push to access female spaces. The subject made him incredibly uncomfortable. He simply did not want to hear it. I then asked him whether he knew what his straight male friends wanted from women in the bedroom, kink/sex-wise. Horrified look. No, of course I bloody don't. I said to him that if you put 100 straight and bi women of our age and average sexual experience in a room together, they could write an authoritative compendium on straight male kink in an afternoon from their own direct experience or that of women they know. I said I presumed he knew that a cross-dressing fetish is one of the most common paraphilias in heterosexual men, and that this has been in the psychological literature since Freud. I cannot overstate how little he wanted to talk about this, let alone acknowledge that any of it was real and happening. I don't know whether it was the idea that women actually talk about what they meet in the bedroom that touched a nerve, or whether he found the whole subject ick, or didn't like the suggestion that he was naive or poorly informed, but the impression given was that I was depraved to say such things aloud, and that he much prefer a seemly silence. What a cool, normal, and well-adjusted woman. Despite all of this, however, despite the insistence by the British Transport Police that every police frisk now comes with a free despite the chief transphobe of the so-called Equality and Human Rights Commission claiming trans women are now openly banned from public spaces demarcated for women, despite insistence from those in authority that this means trans men who pass as men can't go to the bathroom anywhere, and despite reports that some women's toilets have already begun asking for ID for people to enter, despite all these horrors, and the fact that this will lead to women who aren't traditionally feminine, mostly cis women and more often than not lesbian and postmenopausal women being assaulted and unable to safely use spaces in public. Well, despite all of these horrors, I think that the gender criticals have finally overplayed their hand. This decision, despite how little it actually says, is being used, as the cast review was before it, to justify any number of horrific discriminatory decisions that will make the lives of both trans people and cis people significantly worse, and opens the door to anti-gay and anti-abortion moves to come. And, according to some of the prominent trans folks celebrating this, even outright fascist shit like going after immigrants as a clear and present danger to women by default. Everything about this is terrifying. But I've never seen so much public and private outcry to a decision about trans people. Not since this whole trans panic started. I've had so many people reach out, seen so much solidarity from more angles than I ever thought I'd see. Tens of thousands of people protesting in the streets. Even some Labour MPs are reportedly panicking at the outcry and starting to work out how they're going to do damage control over this. My parents, who are lovely but don't normally panic at all about this stuff, partially because they thought they could solve the relentless attacks on trans people by getting the Tories out, and partially because these attacks were going after trans kids and I'm, well, old. They've been distraught. This hit hard. In fact, I got a call from my mum on Easter Sunday after she came back from church, and, well, we'll see if I can tell this story without crying. So my mum calls me Easter Sunday and tells me over the phone that her and my dad have been devastated and outraged about the ruling all week. My siblings were calling asking how I was, and my mum, because we've had these conversations before, knew I'd been inconsolable for days and wanted to give me a little bit of space before she checked in. So, with this in mind, with the heartbreak of this decision still heavy on her mind and my mind, she went to church for Easter, and the priest, a Catholic fucking priest, when asking for the congregation to pray, asked all those in attendance to pray for all the trans people in the country who are scared right now. And my mum told me she was a wreck for the rest of the mass. Someone behind her comforted her while she was crying and she told her what was wrong. A Catholic church. This is the strength of the backlash to this cruel and awful decision. On one side, you have a billionaire smoking a cigar and drinking fucking spritz on a super yacht. On the other, you have everyone from MPs to protesters to Catholic fucking priests, terrified at the suffering this will bring to trans people. This decision was a bridge too far, and I hope we see backlash soon. The Labour Party panic and realise the hate they are bringing upon their party by being the face of this decision, especially given they already face a potentially massive rebellion on their planned benefits cuts that will actively disable people. And by the Labour Party, I suppose that now means I have to put my hope in a potential rebellion of backbenchers, and a minority of them at that, because after I finished the first draft of this script, this happened. Trans women should use toilets according to their biological sex, the Equalities Minister has said. In response to the UK Supreme Court's ruling that a woman is legally defined by her biological sex, Brigitte Phillipson stopped short of explicitly saying trans women should use the men's toilets, but she told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, the ruling was clear, and provisions and services should be accessed on the basis of biological sex. Pushed further for clarification on whether a trans woman should use the men's or women's toilets, she repeated, the ruling is clear. The ruling, is not clear. So, that's our Equalities Minister, of our nominally left-wing party, declaring, despite the actual text of the Supreme Court ruling, that the Supreme Court ruling means that all trans people should use men's toilets, trans men should use women's toilets, and that intersex people should just piss themselves in public. So, in response to this, I suggest we do what the EHRC has already suggested we do, and use our powers of advocacy to campaign for third gender-neutral toilet spaces. And as a representative of the trans community, I would like to suggest a small number of appropriate candidates for gender-neutral toilets. Firstly, Brigitte Phillipson's constituents' office. Secondly, Brigitte Phillipson's house. Thirdly, Wes Streeting, the person. Fourth, Keir Starmer, too, the person. And finally, the massive fuck-off super yachts J.K. Rowling was gloating on making this decision. I'm confident that with enough tranny piss, we can make that monstrous monument to capitalism and hubris sink to the bottom of the ocean, after which we move on to her castle. Listen, Joanne, you brought this upon yourself. If you want to make it impossible for us to use toilets, we don't have a choice. According to your friends, We have to make our own. And that castle's pretty big, so you probably won't even be able to smell it over all the mould. Keir Starmer himself came out the day after I finished the first draft of the script to confirm that he agrees with Baroness Faulkner and Brigitte Phillipson's blatant misunderstandings of the Supreme Court decision too. But in classic Keir Starmer fashion, he welcomed the Supreme Court decision, but encouraged them to go further. And he went further by publicly stating that trans women aren't women and that he expects us to go to the men's bathroom or be accused of breaking the law. To which I can only respond, okay, let's break the fucking law. Let's break the law en masse. They can't arrest us all. There are only about 3 police officers in the country after half a century of Thatcherite economics, so what are they going to do? If they take us to trial, we can point to the actual clear and present danger trans women are in men's toilets, and the fact that the law doesn't actually say what he says it does. And how the rhetoric behind this decision has already led to multiple instances of violence against cis women even. For example, woman, 86, shoved headfirst into wheelie bin by man who thought she was trans. Cisgender woman by man who thought she was trans. 2 cisgender people were in separate attacks motivated by transphobia. Cis woman mistaken as transgender records being berated in the bathroom. Walmart fires 6'4" cisgender woman threatened by man who thought she was trans. Young mum beaten black and blue with crowbar and called vile homophobic transphobic slurs. This is the world Keir Starmer is now openly advocating for. And to rub salt in our wounds, he brought up Brianna fucking Jai's name in the Prime Minister's questions that followed this, invoking the memory of a child murdered because of transphobia while gloating about how transphobic he's being. This is evil. And I suggest that we refuse to comply. In fact, in this case, not only do we have the law on our side, we genuinely have the public on our side. I've not seen a bigger surge of outrage at a government attacking the trans community since the repeal of Section 28. And make no mistake, this is how these relentless attacks on trans people will be thought of as in the future. An evil, cruel attack on minority groups just trying to live their lives. Keir Starmer's name will be spoken of in the same breath as Margaret Thatcher, and his grave, like hers, I promise, will one day become the most popular gender-neutral toilet in the country. And this decision will eventually be challenged, and hopefully overturned, at the European Court of Human Rights. The Good Law Project has already stated its intent to bring it there, but this will take time. And in that time, a lot of harm can and will be done by this evil government, all to try and please 3 or 4 of the most deranged people in the country. Before we go, I want you to have something to hold on to. A little bit of hopium in these terrifying times. As of April 25th, the Good Law Project has made it clear they believe the UK, following the Supreme Court decision, is now in breach of its obligations under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights. The ECHR is actually the reason we have a Gender Recognition Act to start with, since it only came about as a result of the Blair government being sued for failing to legally recognise trans people. The caveat here is that both the Tories and Reform are insistent that we should leave the ECHR as soon as possible, precisely because it can put the brakes on some of the most cruel aspects of the plans of, well, every major party at this point. But for now, we are still a signatory to the ECHR, and as such, this is where I will be looking for the one potential out we have here, besides the government quickly realising that building gender-neutral facilities in literally every publicly accessible place, or installing bathroom cops in every single bathroom in the country.
Gender police.
Lesbian-only spaces.
Gender police. Gender police.
Lesbian-only spaces.
Gender police. Gender police.
Are both such wildly impractical and unenforceable ideas that this guidance is the transphobic equivalent of deciding everyone in the country must turn lead into gold or be executed. The Good Law Project has reportedly already assembled a legal team involving several cases and at least one trans barrister, with specialists in equalities law and informed by the lived experiences of trans people. It will take some time to bring this challenge to the ECHR and have it heard, but it's a start. I will put the link to donate in the description. Keep that future in mind, however, because you deserve to know that we will make it through this. However hard it is now, we will never stop fighting. And even if it takes years, we will win. Because they can't stop us from existing. Until that day comes, keep fighting. We may have been bruised in this battle, but the tides are turning. People are angry, And even though this decision will lead to many horrors to come, we will eventually win this war. Until then, hold in your piss, O trans people and allies, and on the day Keir Starmer dies, release it upon the smug fucker's grave, and let him know what the trans community thinks of him and his traitorous fucking corpse. One day, he will indeed rest in piss. And until that day comes, thanks for watching. Tell me what you see. I don't need an excuse to build it all myself. Tell me how to breathe. As if I need your approval to hate myself. Give me strength to see. See through your position and you'll tell me how to disappear. Believe me, I would vanish if you'd let me. Right outside your grasp, there's a world that doesn't care, wouldn't dare to ask. Take me on your ark, dare to sail away with me to paradise, re-embark. Right outside your grasp, I can be your parasite and you can be my shark. You can be my shark. Listen and you'll see I'm doing all I can to improve myself. One big fun honey. Not that I don't need it, but I'm worried I'll hate myself if happiness were free. I'm sure that knowing my disease, you'll learn to take that from me. Why give me reprieve? Believe me, I would vanish if you'd let me. I'll be right outside your grasp. In a world that doesn't care, wouldn't dare to ask. Take me on your ark, dare to sail away with me to paradise we embark. Right outside your grasp, I can be your parasite and you can be my shark. You can be my... I'm sure you'd love to chase the wake and exercise your wrath. I'm sure you'd love to chew my lifeboat and watch it collapse. I'm sure you'd love to call me parasite and watch them laugh. I'm sure you'd love to come and feast upon my flesh. But I'm right outside your grasp. In a world that doesn't care, wouldn't dare to ask. Take me on your ark, Dare to sail away with me to paradise we embark. I'll be right outside your grasp. Sure, I'll be your parasite if you will be my shark. And you will be my shark. Hey, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you like this video, why not like it, leave a comment, subscribe, and tell your friends about it. And give me money, because I have none, and I would like to get out of debt. And by debt, I mean my £2,000 overdraft, which I've been in since I was a master's student. So, you know, if people ever tell you academia pays, they're wrong, and they're lying to you. So you can help with that by giving me one-time donations on Ko-fi or PayPal, links below, as always, or you can sign up to my Patreon, where you can get early videos, access to the members-only Discord with a lovely community, my Netted Switch friend code if you're interested in that, and exclusive content such as long-form interviews with previous guests of the show. And in addition to all that good stuff, you'll also, if you sign up, get your name read out at the end of each video, just like these lovely, lovely, lovely people. Lee Wilkins, George Geddes, Kira B, No Sparkling Heart, Corey, Matt J, Martin the Sword, Carolyn, Imogen Q, Luciana Flores Andrade, Adam, Harry, Ndog191, Cav, Quesadilla, Azul, Ron, Adam Lees, Daniel Nevels, No Not That, Paul, MB, Madeline Aguirre, Ben Murphy, Lex Phoenix, Enthel Kurzitz, Mira D, Jade Senior, Bowen E, James W. Marvin, or Foreign Gill, Bob the Builder, 5445554, Deborah Laboon, Vegas, Zilla Zathanium, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Lassette, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena Real, Sierra Whiskey, Orestria, Ali Catgirl, John N, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Krebich, Shield Thaden, Robin Podolsky, Turtle, Troon, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philita Tabraga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Sharty Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexander Lilly, Howard Lott, Neranier, Scarchan, and Joey Cobalt. Thank you all for supporting me and the show. And just in case it wasn't clear, I'm not detransitioning. I also thought about using that as a clickbait, but I thought that was too cruel. We need some sense of hope. So enjoy this. We will win eventually. Fuck Keir Starmer. I hope he. I'm not going to finish that thought because I don't want to go to prison. Okay. Good night. Good night. Okay. Good night. I guess we're in bed together. Give you a little kiss on the cheek. Good night. Sweet dreams, baby. What's wrong with me?